Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Lebanon and specifically French involvement in that country, especially since the blast that took place in the Lebanese capital, Beirut, the port blast that, of course, was devastating for that country and, of course, its infrastructure, and, of course, brought up a whole bunch of issues which Lebanese had already been protesting for a significant number of months in the lead up to that blast, such as corruption, mismanagement, weak governance, or just the problems within the governance system as a whole. Now, the French President Macron has visited the country twice so far, and there is some chatter in some quarters, back and forth about what exactly this French involvement means. Some people keep bringing up the terms like colonialism and whether or not France is trying to reinstate in some ways its mandate over Lebanon. Others are saying that why is Macron still, for example, okay with having Hezbollah, for example, in any Lebanese government at this point in time. There's a lot of chatter both ways, but nevertheless, there's also then that concern, right, about the Lebanese obviously having the priority over their own decisions. And of course, that should always be in the hands of the Lebanese people to decide for the direction in which they would want their country to go, and be it regarding governance, accountability, et cetera, et cetera. Let's just discuss all of that a bit further. I join with Meguerditchian, who is a Lebanese journalist. He is joining us currently from Paris. Joining us from the Lebanese capital, Beirut, is Bachar Halabi, who is a geopolitical analyst with Clipper Data Analytics, NYC. Bachar and Van, thank you both for your time today. Van, let me start with you. What do you make about Macron's two trips, right? I mean, it does seem a bit odd for a foreign leader to be this involved in Lebanon in such quick succession. I mean, it's just been a number of weeks since his previous trip.
Well, Waqar, President Macron started after being elected French president 3 years ago. He started his involvement on the Lebanese issue 2 years ago when he hosted Lebanese leaders in Paris to have a conference to find the grants, the money needed for Lebanon to get back on its feet again. This was in Paris in 2018, a few months before the parliamentary elections in Lebanon. I heard a lot of people saying about whether France is trying to reinstate its former colonial status in Lebanon. I mean, I think it's kind of a little bit far-fetched at the moment to agree on that, because the way I see it, the only thing so far France is reinstating in Lebanon through the multiple visits of President Emmanuel Macron is that France is reinstating the failed political class that has become an enemy of most Lebanese people, whether they support the government or whether they support the Lebanese parties or not. This failed political class was cornered. They couldn't move anymore. Leaders, politicians, ministers, parliament members, they couldn't go to restaurants. They couldn't go have coffee outside their homes and outside their castles. President Macron arrived, and the French initiative today is trying to give them some breathing space today. That's how I can see it.
Sure. What are your thoughts on that? Because, as I said to Van, it does seem odd that a foreign leader would be this involved, right, in Lebanese politics. Is it almost a cover for the establishment, the current Lebanese establishment, to just go back to the business as usual in some ways?
Good afternoon, Waqar, and good afternoon to Van as well. Well, to start with, and just a heads up, President Macron has, as Van mentioned, has been heavily involved in Lebanese politics. And I would take you to the incident that happened in November 2017. So Macron back then was on his way back from the UAE. He was attending the opening of the Louvre Museum. He passed by Riyadh. He made sure to get Saad al-Hariri out of Riyadh and bring him to Paris. And then Saad al-Hariri flew back to Beirut. After that, he was reinstated as the prime minister. He walked back his resignation. And then after that, the SAD conference, it's the donor mainly conference held in Paris, was the boost needed for both Saad al-Hariri, who became at that time France's main ally and France's basically man in Beirut, in addition to propping up the sectarian power-sharing arrangement, which France originally instated back in 1920 at the when Greater Lebanon was announced 100 years earlier. Nowadays, what's happening has to do less with the sentimentality and more to do with the irony of history. As Van mentioned, France is not really in a position to reinstate its mandate over Lebanon. France also understands the limitation of its power in Lebanon because it's definitely not the main power broker. The two main power brokers in Beirut today are Iran and the United States to a certain extent. What France is doing is trying to play the middleman between these two powers on the Lebanese political scene. And this directly benefits President Macron's foreign policy, which entails him positioning himself as a mediator between the West in general and between Iran, keeping in mind and in sight the presidential elections and the American presidential elections in November, which might bring a new president to the Oval Office. And this is when the Democratic candidate might want to reinstate a nuclear deal with Iran, and France would be well positioned to play that role.
Van, one of the things that came up, obviously, during this latest Macron trip is not his outright support for Hezbollah, but, the fact that he's okay with, of course, Hezbollah being still within the governing system as it's understood right now. Now, I wonder if that's something that's beyond France's control anyhow, right? Because whether, some Lebanese like it or not, Hezbollah is still a political force, right? Beyond, and I'm not talking about its military wing, right? I'm just talking about its political influence within the country. It still has its supporters, right? A significant number of supporters. Is it as simple as saying to France that, listen, you shouldn't be speaking to those politicians because they are from the Hezbollah party?
No, as the French president said, he was in Beirut to talk to all Lebanese leaders, all Lebanese political parties who are in power. And as Macron said, these political parties were elected through an election 2 years ago. Now, whether President Macron should talk to Hezbollah because Hezbollah has a bigger power and more influence in Lebanese politics, or he shouldn't talk to them, is another question. Look, the way I see it, what Macron achieved, in my opinion, is that he was able to internationalize the Lebanese crisis. Today, all newspapers around the world are talking about how the situation in Lebanon is an international issue, how French president addressed the crisis by saying, I cannot simply ignore Hezbollah because Hezbollah, if I decide not to talk with Hezbollah or the other leaders, I would just go back to France and the problem in Lebanon would persist. Having said that, although he just gave a new life, a few months perhaps, to this political class controlled by Hezbollah, he internationalized the crisis and at the same time brought Hezbollah's arms problem to the forefront of the discussion. He said, from now on, in the next few months, if the new government succeeds in launching reform programs, we have to sit down and talk about Hezbollah's weapons. Now, it might have looked like that the president gave a lot more leverage to Hezbollah at this point. But if you look at it closely, Hezbollah, the political party, the militant Iranian proxy in the region, that portrays itself to be against imperialism and against foreign influence. They were just sitting there in the same room with the French president sent by Washington and Paris to take orders from the West itself, which is the irony here.
Yeah, no, I see that point. Bachar, what are your thoughts about the Hezbollah angle on all this? Because, I wonder if down the line, if there already is a French plan to have Hezbollah somehow, slowly moved out of Lebanese politics. I mean, I don't even know if that's possible or not. You can fill me in on that, because I would imagine that for a group that is that influential, that it's probably next to impossible to have it completely out of the establishment in some way and to have the kind of influence it has. What do you make of the fact, as Van brought up, which I also found ironic, to be honest, is that Hezbollah was still in some ways okay with the plans that Macron has presented for reforms?
So we have to look into the Hezbollah model in general on two levels. The first level is international, and the second one is local. On the international level, we see that throughout the past decade or so, there has been a drive to criminalize Hezbollah after it has been accepted as a political organization based in Lebanon with representation in parliament and being part of the sectarian power sharing arrangement. So in the past few years, we saw that Hezbollah has been fully understood mostly by the international community, and it has been enlisted in several places, mainly Germany, which is a major base for Hezbollah in Europe, has been enlisted as a terrorist organization. So we can see that the atmosphere on the international level is starting to change. On a more local level, Hezbollah has always followed the policy of a carrot and a stick. What it has done throughout the past 15 years since the assassination of Prime Minister Rafiq al-Hariri, it has threatened its adversaries, its competitors, and it has rewarded its allies with larger shares and more power within the system. This has resulted in more and more growth of Hezbollah's power within the Lebanese system up until the moment it fully controlled it following the 2016 presidential deal, which brought the main ally of Hezbollah into the presidency. And in 2018, it controlled the parliament after the parliamentary elections, which resulted in a government fully adherent to Hezbollah's power. This put Hezbollah at the forefront of Lebanese politics. And in face of people frustrated and angry on two things: the dire economic situation, which has been ongoing and downward sloping since 2015, in addition to the lack of services and the entrenchment of the sectarian mentality in the country, which people right now are starting to turn against. Yeah. This resulted in growing public sentiment, in a growing anti-Hezbollah public sentiment throughout the past few years. And the epitome of that was the moment of October 17, when people took to the streets denouncing the sectarian power-sharing arrangement in general. However, Hezbollah decided to put its thugs mainly in face of these protesters and to crack down on the revolutionary movement that was a precedent and a historic moment in Lebanese political history in general, because it transcended sectarian fault lines in general. So nowadays, yes.
Sorry, I'm quickly running out of time. I just wanted to get Van. Van, I want to give you the final word, if I may. Going back to just, the role of Lebanese within, taking control of their own country's issues, right? I wonder at what point in the near future you see that happening, because at this point in time, it just feels like we're sort of back to square one, aren't we? We're sure, if we're talking about the Iranians, the Americans, or even the French, at the end of the day, each of the above will have their own national interests. And as much as they may say that they have good intentions towards the country, they'll always, of course, prioritize their own country's national interests. So even with Macron involved, I imagine at the back of his mind, he has something which he wants to gain from this for his own country's national interests. When do the Lebanese get the power back in their hands to decide what they want to do for their country's future?
That's a very good question, Waqar. I think that's exactly why occupations do not last. That's exactly why oppression doesn't last. That's exactly why countries fight for independence. And that's exactly why the Lebanese should fight for their freedom and their independence. And they've been fighting for this for the past 15, 20 years. The Syrians withdrew in 2005. Remnants of the Syrian regime stayed in Lebanon, headed by certain political parties that were armed to the teeth. Now, how do Lebanese come out of this crisis? The Lebanese have to come out of this crisis by themselves. Only the Lebanese can ensure that they can ensure to have a government that represents the people, only the Lebanese can ensure there would be a government one day, a president one day, that would ensure the Lebanese national interests. France is not going to ensure Lebanese national interests.
Yeah.
France is going to ensure French interests, and America is going to ensure American interests. So the Lebanese, if they can stand on their feet and they can be patient and continue to fight, as we are seeing every day, brave women and men fighting on the streets against the violence.
Yeah.
At some point, they will achieve this if they remain united.
All right, we'll have to leave this as a final word, but we appreciate both Van and Bachar for putting this into context for us, because as I said at the end there to Van, we can talk as much as we want about French involvement, American involvement, Iranian involvement in Lebanon, and certainly, as with any country, external players' involvement in any country's affairs are always problematic because national interests always are priority. So it's not like somebody's going to do things out of just the kindness of their heart for others without wanting something in return. So this is the same case now for Lebanon. And sure, there are many domestic issues which do need to be dealt with, very legitimate issues, long-standing issues of the system of governance, corruption, mismanagement, et cetera, et cetera. All of that needs to be dealt with, but it needs to be dealt with by Lebanese themselves. And somehow the world or Lebanese themselves need to figure out a mechanism to be able to do that, so that we're not then talking about and debating French involvement, American involvement, Iranian involvement, that we're just debating then Lebanese fixing their own issues and figuring out how best to do that going forward. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Stoke with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss the United States, which has vetoed a UN resolution calling for the prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration of those who are engaged or have been engaged in terrorism-related activities, specifying that it wanted this resolution to also call for the repatriation of ISIS foreign fighters from the likes of Syria and Iraq, as well as their families, which the United States has called essential. Now, to quite an extent, this makes sense, at least to me, and of course I will put this to my guests in a few moments as well, where the U.S., the concern from the U.S., is that they do not want Iraq or Syria to become a nucleus of ISIS 2.0. That's an exact quote of the U.S. ambassador to the UN. And again, it makes sense to have these people go back to their respective countries of citizenship and nationality and to be prosecuted there, to be brought forth in front of courts and to be held accountable for their crimes if they're able to be proven. Let me put that now to our guests. As I said, we're now joined by Dr. Magnus Norell, who is an adjunct scholar at Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He's also senior policy advisor at the European Foundation for Democracy. He's joining us today from Stockholm. Joining us from Stoke-on-Trent in the UK is Dr. Hamourtziadou, who is a senior lecturer at Birmingham City University and is also principal researcher of the Iraq body count. Lily and Magnus, thank you both for your time today. Magnus, let me start with you. As I said in my introduction there, the argument of not wanting Iraq and Syria to become a nucleus of ISIS 2.0, that makes sense, right? So then why do other countries such as Britain and France, do you think, why do they have a hard time accepting repatriation of these ISIS fighters?
Yeah, right. Yeah, it does make sense. I think the major reason is that several European countries there's no consensus within the European Union on how to treat the returnees. And by arguing that they should be prosecuted where they're at, that would that's a convenient escape hatch for a number of European countries that don't have to deal with the problems of having the returnees return. In the cases like my own country, for instance, Sweden, where that happened, where people have been returning, it's been a huge problem. And it is very much a security issue. So I think it's a convenient way of not dealing with the issue specifically, I'm afraid.
Lily, what are your thoughts about that? Because, it almost seems like if you don't have the repatriation occur, as the U.S. quite logically, in fact, says, we would have these people, in close quarters right now in prisons in Iraq and Syria, and they may very well, if allowed to, plan God forbid, further attacks, wouldn't they?
Yes. Well, first of all, I don't think that a trial in Iraq or in Syria would actually have any good outcome. I know very well from my research that in Iraq, people are regularly tortured to death as detainees without even having been convicted of a crime. So I don't think they could have justice. I certainly agree that it is, with Magnus, that it is convenient to pass on the problem to someone else. But I also believe that if we allow them to come back and they stand trial and we get to hear their stories, I think that may damage, say, Britain or the USA in other ways, as well as other countries from which these people have left. And I think it's another way to silence people who have things to say, because I'm sure that these people who left their countries to go and join an enemy, a declared enemy of their country, did this knowingly, willingly, and I would like to know why they did it. I want to know their story, but I don't think the government wants us to hear their story.
That's interesting, Magnus. I wonder what you think of that, because it does seem like, beyond just trying to put this on the heads of the Iraqis and the Syrians to deal with this somehow, or somebody in the international community right at the venue point, as you had said, in Iraq and Syria, it does seem like there might be something more happening behind the scenes. Is it a question of, do you think, maybe treating each individual case by case to try to understand motivation, all of the above?
Well, yeah, all of the above, really. First of all, I agree with having trials in Syria and Iraq is not necessarily conducive to a just trial. I agree completely with that. But then again, I don't think it's a question of not wanting to hear their stories. That we're hearing the stories all the time. I mean, there's a lot of research going on already. A number of people have testified already in various places, and as I said, a number of people have returned. I think it's more there's no rational thing. Well, there's a rational thinking, but there's no thought through thinking here from the European Union side of how to deal with this, because it's a contentious and it's a very sensitive issue. And again, I emphasize that. I think it's a way trying not to deal with that issue by having it sort of being solved, quote unquote, in the region. And there, of course, there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. I mean, for instance, countries like France and Belgium they tend to look at each and individual cases where there is one, and in some cases there are people allowing people to return. In other cases, they strip them of their citizenships. So there's a number of ways to deal with this. It's just that the majority of countries here try not to deal with it in a sort of a general way, and it's sort of from a European Union point of view. And I don't think that's not going to be possible. There's too many countries involved here, and there's too many various ways to deal with this.
Yeah. Liddy, I wonder what you may think might happen next, right? Because it seems that we are now entering into the stalemate situation overall when it comes to repatriation. And if there are certainly countries, as Magnus there mentioned about Sweden, there are countries that are taking their respective citizens back and, putting them on trial and holding them accountable if the evidence is there, et cetera, which is, of course, in and of itself a challenging process as well, no doubt, for those courts and lawyers involved. But nevertheless, do you think that will eventually have to happen, or do you think we'll always just have these people sitting there in Iraq and Syria in unknown conditions, inhumane conditions in many ways, and just without accountability of some sort?
Yes, I think accountability is a problem in the country that I live in, certainly, in the UK. We are not holding accountable people that we know have committed crimes against civilians in Iraq, for instance, British people. We are reluctant to hold accountable people who have left the UK to go somewhere else and possibly commit crimes. So the issue of accountability is very big in this country. So I'm not optimistic about the future, actually. And although we know that in the last 20 years, there have been various trials of people in this country, in the UK, for crimes, accused of crimes associated with terrorism in some way, and there have been many convictions, I don't even know what these people said in court. I mean, as a member of the public, I have no access to what took place during those trials. So and that to me is a problem as well. And I don't think they want us to know. There is certainly research going into motivation and so on, but how about the actual people who have been convicted or are being tried for these crimes? It almost doesn't matter, by the way, as long as there are convictions and justice is seen to be done in that way or in some way, then we are told that we should be okay with that our country is taking care of us.
That's a very good point, Magnus, because, in this way, it seems we're putting a lot of trust in these respective governments, right? So we're trusting the British to do what's right by their own citizens and by their public, of course, vis-a-vis national security and all of the above. Very legitimate arguments, certainly, but we don't know what happens necessarily in these terrorism courts all the time, because the argument is made that, listen, these things need to be kept secret for the sake of national security. So it's sort of like this vicious cycle, right? And then on top of that, I wanted to add this as well, if you can give your opinion on this, about the issue of citizenship, right? The issue of Salma Begum, for example, in the UK, and, the talk of, revoking her citizenship. What are your thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, well, it's a tool. Let me start with the last one. It's a tool that is being used by some countries, and it's very sensitive and should be used as a very sort of the last resort, if you ask me, because stripping someone of citizenship is a pretty huge thing. So I don't think that's going to be a very common way to deal with it. And I agree with the fact that we are very often left in the dark. The public on what's going on here behind the scenes. But then again, very few people have been actually prosecuted, for their crimes or for their presumed crimes in Iraq and Syria. And part of that is, of course, because it's very difficult to prove. The evidence is hard to come by. And again, I think that adds to the fact that it will be much more convenient for European countries not to have this problem on their doorsteps or inside their house. And that's why they prefer to have it done in Iraq and in Syria, which is not going to happen in a good way anyway. So I think I share a little pessimistic view here of the future. I'm very doubtful if it's going to be a sensible solution here in the short while. I'm afraid that what we're having now, what we're seeing now, is probably what we're going to see for the foreseeable future, I'm afraid.
Lily, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. This then means, doesn't it, in some ways, Lily, if we are to just hypothetically presume for a moment that all of the above foreign fighters, as they're alleged to be, who are being held right now in Iraq and Syria in those prisons, are guilty of the crimes that, are associated with them and they're alleged to have committed, then that just means that in some ways the Middle East remains this venue of, terrorism and these sort of criminal acts, and no one in the world is really willing to deal with that in a reasonable fashion. Is that a fair assessment?
That is sadly a fair assessment, and that has been my experience of doing daily research in Iraq security. No one really wants to address the issue. They do only insofar as they benefit from it in some way, through some deal or some access to something. There are daily attacks in Iraq. There are daily bombings, from various countries, and the impact on the Iraqis is huge. And to say, well, terrorism now is Iraq's problem. It has been sadly Iraq's problem for a long time. And it's like we are condemning these people now to never-ending violence rather than actually take charge and say, we will do something. We will hold people accountable. We will find a good way of dealing with the problem of terror rather than passing it on, patching it up, or just going only so far as it serves our interests.
All right, we'll leave that as a final word, but we appreciate both Lily and Magnus for their time today. Magnus, they're speaking to us from Stockholm, and Lily was speaking to us from Stoke on Trent in the UK. Viewers will be back discussing this further right after this break with two new panelists. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're continuing to discuss that U.S. veto of a resolution at the United Nations, specifically to deal with terrorists and rehabilitation, prosecution, etc., all of the above, because the U.S. had concerns, in my eyes, legitimate, about repatriation and the need to not have a nucleus of ISIS 2.0, as the U.S. ambassador to the UN put it. Those are exact quotes of her words, in fact. Let me put that to two new panelists who are joining us to take this discussion forward. We're joined now by Dr. Andreea Stoian Karadeli, who is an independent researcher based in Istanbul. She's a Global Associate Fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. She is joining us from Istanbul, as I said. Joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. is Michael Lane, who is the founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy. Michael and Andreea, thank you both for your time today. Michael, let me start with you. It seems quite logical, in fact, what the U.S. is saying, right? Saying that we need to have the repatriation of these ISIS foreign fighters, as well as their family members. And to be held accountable in whatever way each country deems fit according to their laws, etc., rather than having them all grouped into these prisons in Iraq and Syria, respectively, where they possibly, if they are guilty of all the crimes they're alleged to have committed, they could possibly be planning even further terrorism. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's a very difficult decision, I think, to make all the way around. Look, the United States is right. The real problem is the ISIS fighters and their families and remaining elements in Syria and Iraq, and they need to be dealt with. The difficulty is that the resolution that came before the United Nations specifically did not deal with them, dealt with the rest of the problem. And so now you're in a situation where the UN can say, okay, we acted, we did what we were supposed to do, and it will be a long time, if ever, before they circle back and come up to the real part of the problem. On the other hand, the United States is sitting there saying, well, we don't want to solve half the problem. We want to solve the whole problem now, and taking one small step forward on the road to success without making it 3 giant steps to solve the whole problem just doesn't work for us. It remains to be seen what additional diplomacy there will be behind the scenes. Will the countries that voted against, and let's be fair, it was a 14-1 vote, so virtually everyone was on the process or on the script of let's solve part of the problem, not all of the problem. So Ambassador Kraft has a huge uphill battle now to re-engage with the Security Council, to persuade them that there is a need to address the bigger part of the problem, and to see if all the parties can come together. Let's keep our eyes on the ball over the next month at the UN, see that happens.
Because Andreea, on one side, certainly we have the lack of political courage, if I may use that term, on the part of the British and the French and the others who voted against this resolution on dealing with repatriation of their own citizens who are alleged to have committed these terrorist acts. And then on the other hand, then we basically then are saying that the Middle East, especially Iraq and Syria, will inevitably, for the foreseeable future, be stuck with these people and the ramifications of that. I mean, if they are dealt with there and still released and carry out terrorist attacks, it just means the Middle East is forever sort of, going to be haunted by this sort of terrorism. What are your thoughts on that?
Please allow me to begin by saying that for the first time on this topic, a veto made me feel so optimistic. I've been, throughout my research, I work on Syria, I work on Daesh, and I've been following the evolution of the situation since 2010. I can tell you that I've been lobbying towards having the situation solved out in a way that includes repatriation, and in several meetings and gatherings, international gatherings, I've proved throughout my research the fact that we are actually looking at a time bomb, basically, when we look at the camps in Syria. As you said, it's a lack of political courage when it comes to the European countries, but at the same time is a lack of judicial and legislative solutions at the same time. Even within the European Union, within the countries of the European Union, we have different understandings and legislation in terms of what represents a terrorist act. And this makes it very, very difficult for those people that have been traveling, that have been or have not been committing any terrorist acts or any violent acts in Syria to be, to put on a trial and eventually convicted. Then there is another situation, is the fact that, and I know from my research, I know very well the situation now in the camps. I can tell you that it's an increased radicalization among the women and children, because those are now the risk categories. So we are now risking what America has been, pointing out through its veto, is the fact that we are kind of repeating our past mistakes.
Indeed.
And we risk to face in the future a new wave of Salafi jihadism, even worse one, that will be represented by the kids that are now in those camps and that face several trauma. And that, again, is not the case of having them separated from their families either.
Indeed.
We have to find a solution that will not bring any more trauma to the situation.
I wonder what you make of that, that time bomb, comparison, because this does seem like a time bomb, right? And then, I also wanted to add this on because as we've all agreed, these are still tough issues to deal with. It's not like it's going to be easy for any country to be able to hold any of the above fighters accountable, because all of the countries have rules of law, right? So you have to prove it according to your respective laws and courts. And because if we don't follow our own laws in our respective countries, then we're sort of like, defeating the purpose of having those laws to begin with and holding these people accountable in a fair fashion. How does one go about doing that in a logical fashion? I mean, this seems like almost a monumental task for any country to deal with.
Yeah, it is. And that's why, for the most part, the Western countries are opposing this because, they have to do things, as you point out, Waqar, according to their own domestic laws if they're going to be tried domestically in those countries. And that's good. That's the way it should be, I believe. But the problem is, how are you going to get convictions on these people? You may know what they do, and there may be people who are willing to testify as to what they did. But those witnesses are not in the host countries where the trials will take place. And in fact, there's relatively little reason to believe that they would be successfully able to get those witnesses in. Any evidence that might exist will be left in the on the battlefield or someplace in the Syrian or Iraqi theaters. So actually, according to the domestic laws of each country, prosecuting these people that are guilty but maybe can't prove it to your own domestic standards becomes a big problem. That's why these countries are resisting it. And okay, so they resist it and they prevent themselves from having a problem at home as to what to do with these people. Ultimately, they perhaps would need to be released, which would be a disaster. But at the same time, leaving them in place where they are is a disaster as well. You've got not only the humanitarian problems in these detention camps, which are quite severe, but also, ISIS, to the point that it still exists and tries to reconstitute itself, is dedicated and committed to attacks on these camps to free these fighters and let them come back and join the whole fight. It's a list of bad situations, but dispersing the people and re-educating them and reprogramming them into society is the long-term solution that works if we can find a way to do it.
Andreea, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. Do you think that the international community, and I'm talking specifically now about international organizations, such as the United Nations and more specifically possibly the ICC or other such venues, need to get involved? Because we know that the Iraqis and the Syrians don't have the ability themselves to be able to deal with this situation because, they're still very much coming out of respective wars or still in the midst of them, in fact. Is that the way to go to deal with this if those countries of which these people are nationalities, citizens of, don't deal with it?
I strongly believe that what we really need right now is kind of a common understanding or a common platform in the way we are going to trial and convict those people. Then we have to differentiate between the FTFs and their families, and we need to differentiate in the way we're going to develop a strategy when we bring them back home. Then there's something else also that I would definitely want to mention is the fact that it's not just a humanitarian crisis that we're witnessing now in those camps, is also the danger of having a second breaking walls campaign coming from Daesh, and that would be a disaster because we would go back to where we were before this whole crisis. So just to end it here, I would come up with one idea that I've been always pushing towards would be the fact that when it comes to the FTFs, of course, the trials and the legislation has to be developed, but when it comes to their families, the women and the children have to be taken to separate facilities where they would be together and they would be, if you want to call it a prison, if you want to call it a trial call it as you are, but there needs to be, we need specialized facilities for those families to be taken in the countries of provenience, as in the countries in Europe where they come from. Yeah. We need to develop such a capacity, and we need to start spending money on this, and not on, various, theoretically speaking, very good research and so on, but at the same time, we need to be more productive and get to, real solutions to those issues. So those kind of facilities, those kind of, capabilities would be best at the moment.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final word, but we, of course, thank Andreea and Michael for their time today. Andreea, they're speaking to us from Istanbul, and Michael speaking to us this morning from Washington, D.C. Now, as all four of our guests so far have spoken of, it does actually make sense what the U.S. has said. I don't say this often, but at the United Nations, as Andreea there said, this is the one time that I actually agree with the U.S. veto, at least on the face of it, from what we have the facts out there. The U.S. is saying we need to deal with the repatriation issue as well of all of these alleged ISIS foreign fighters, as well as their families. They need to be dealt with. We can't just say we're going to rehabilitate and prosecute and, deal with this just within Iraq and Syria themselves. Those countries we know do not have the judicial infrastructure in place, as well as even just the prison facilities, which are proper to be able to deal with all of the above, as well as their family members, and to prevent radicalization, to prevent abuses, human rights abuses I'm talking about specifically here. Why don't countries around the world take responsibility for their respective citizens, ensure that they do things according to their respective laws, as well as they would need to for any other criminal act or other terrorists, far-right terrorists, for example, in countries. We've just had the Brenton Tarrant case, for example, in New Zealand. The law was followed there. Why can't the same be done for ISIS foreign fighters as well in their respective countries? A lot of questions, certainly monumental task for any country to deal with, but it needs to be done. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.